The evening started like every other family gathering over the past 5 years, with my older sister Jessica making sure everyone knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. As the hostess seated us at Bellacourt, the city's most exclusive Italian restaurant, Jessica immediately grabbed the wine menu and started her performance. "Sarah, honey, maybe you should look at the appetizer section," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I know your salary at the warehouse doesn't really stretch to places like this." I glanced at the menu. Entrees ranged from $45 to $85. The wine list started at $30 a glass. For most people it was expensive. For someone making minimum wage at a distribution center, it would be a week's salary. "Thanks for thinking of me," I said quietly, studying the pasta selection. Mom beamed at Jessica like she just solved world hunger. "That's so thoughtful of you, sweetie. Sarah, your sister is just looking out for you. You know how hard it's been since you dropped out of college." The familiar sting hit right on target. I'd left college 8 years ago when Dad had his first heart attack. Someone needed to take care of the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, and someone needed to work full-time to keep money coming in. That someone had been me. Jessica was in her final year of law school then, and my younger brother Marcus was starting his sophomore year pre-med. Both were too important to interrupt their futures. But that's not how the family tells the story now. "I still don't understand why you just gave up," Dad said, not looking up from his menu. "Marcus managed to finish medical school while working part-time. Jessica graduated law school with honors. But you just quit." "Some people aren't cut out for higher education," Jessica added helpfully. "And that's okay. The world needs warehouse workers too." Marcus nodded sagely from across the table. At 26, he just finished his residency and landed a position at Children's Hospital. "The important thing is finding work that matches your capabilities," he said. "Not everyone can handle the pressure of professional careers." I took a sip of water and said nothing. This was the script we followed at every family dinner, every holiday, every birthday celebration. Jessica would establish her superiority, Marcus would provide the psychological analysis, and Mom and Dad would nod along like this was all perfectly reasonable. My role was to sit quietly and accept their assessment of my life. "Remember when you used to talk about being a chef?" Mom asked, her tone suggesting she was reminiscing about a child's fantasy of becoming a dinosaur. "You were always in the kitchen trying to recreate dishes from restaurants. I should have known then that your ambitions were more practical." "Food service is honest work," Dad agreed. "Nothing wrong with knowing your limitations." The server approached our table, a young woman with perfect posture and an expensive-looking uniform. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bellacourt. Can I start you with some wine recommendations?" Jessica immediately took charge as she always did. "We'll need something impressive. This is a celebration, our mother's 60th birthday. What do you have that's really special?" "Our sommelier recommends the 2015 Barolo," the server replied. "It's $120 per bottle." Jessica's eyes lit up. "Perfect. And I think we'll all start with the seafood tower. The large one." I glanced at the menu again. The large seafood tower was $180. With the wine, appetizers, and entrees, this dinner would easily cost over $600. Jessica was making a point as usual. She could afford to treat the family to expensive dinners. I could not. "Actually," Dad interjected, "maybe Sarah would prefer something more in her range. The chicken parmesan is only $38. "Dad, it's fine," I said. "I can afford dinner." "Sweetie, we know you're proud," Mom said, reaching over to pat my hand. "But there's no shame in being practical. Your sister can handle the expensive dishes. You should order what makes sense for your budget." The familiar heat rose in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something deeper. The careful patience I'd been building for 8 years. I'd learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. When I'd tried to explain the real reason I'd left college, they'd accused me of making excuses. When I'd mentioned the 60-hour weeks I'd worked to cover Dad's medical bills, they'd said I was being dramatic. When I'd pointed out that I'd taken over the mortgage payments for 6 months after Dad's surgery, Jessica had said I was keeping score and being petty. So I'd stopped explaining. I'd stopped defending myself. I'd learned to sit quietly while they rewrote history and accept their version of events. It was easier than fighting a battle I could never win. "The chicken parmesan sounds perfect," I said with a smile. Jessica looked satisfied. Great choice. Very sensible. The server took our orders and disappeared. The conversation moved on to Marcus's new position at the hospital, Jessica's latest case at her law firm, and Mom's garden club. I listened and nodded at appropriate intervals, playing my assigned role as the family's cautionary tale. "Oh, I forgot to mention," Jessica said as we waited for our appetizers. "David and I are looking at houses in Riverside Estates. We found this amazing colonial with 6 bedrooms and a 3-car garage. Riverside Estates was the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Houses there started at $800,000 and went up to several million. That's wonderful, honey," Mom gushed. "You two have worked so hard. You deserve every bit of success. The down payment alone is more than most people make in 5 years," Jessica continued, clearly enjoying herself. "But David's promotion to partner came with a substantial bonus, and my caseload has been incredibly lucrative." She glanced at me to make sure I was properly impressed by her success. "Of course, we'll need to furnish it appropriately. We're thinking of hiring an interior designer. Someone who understands quality." "Money well spent," Dad agreed. "First impressions matter in your line of work. Clients need to see that you're successful." "Exactly," Jessica said. "Image is everything in professional careers. People judge you by your surroundings, your clothes, where you eat dinner." She gestured around the elegant restaurant. "Places like this send a message about who you are." The message was clear. She belonged in places like Bellacourt. I did not. Our appetizers arrived. The massive seafood tower Jessica had ordered, along with several smaller plates. Everything looked exquisite and expensive. Jessica made a show of photographing the food for her social media, angling her phone to capture the restaurant's elegant interior. "This will look amazing on Instagram," she said. "My followers love seeing the high-end places David and I discover." "How many followers do you have now?" Mom asked, clearly proud. "Almost 15,000, Jessica replied. "Mostly other lawyers and professionals. It's actually great for networking. I've gotten 3 new clients just from people who saw my restaurant posts." Marcus nodded approvingly. Social media presence is crucial for professional development. Potential employers and clients research everything these days. "Exactly why I'm careful about what I post," Jessica said, taking another photo. "You have to curate an image that reflects your status and aspirations. People need to see that you operate at a certain level." I understood the subtext. My social media presence, what little existed of it, would not reflect the kind of status worth advertising. My life would not impress Jessica's professional network. "Sarah, you should really work on building your online presence," Mom suggested. "Maybe post some pictures from your warehouse job. Show people that you're employed and responsible." "That's sweet, Mom," Jessica said with a condescending smile. "But Sarah's work isn't really the kind of thing that builds professional credibility. Maybe she could post some of her cooking experiments instead." Food blogs are popular with regular people. Regular people. As opposed to Jessica's professional network of lawyers and doctors and executives. Our entrees arrived, and the conversation continued along familiar lines. Jessica described her latest legal victory, a complex corporate case that had earned her firm substantial fees. Marcus talked about a difficult pediatric surgery he'd assisted with. Mom and Dad hung on every word, asking detailed questions and expressing appropriate amazement at their successful children's accomplishments. When they turned to me, the questions were different. "How are things at the warehouse, Sarah?" Dad asked, his tone suggesting he was inquiring about a temporary situation rather than my actual career. "Fine," I replied. "Busy season is starting, so there's lots of overtime available." "Overtime is good," Mom said encouragingly. "Every little bit helps when you're on a tight budget." "Just don't burn yourself out," Jessica added. "Physical labor takes a toll on the body. You need to think about your long-term health." Marcus nodded professionally. "Repetitive stress injuries are common in warehouse work. You should be careful about your posture and lifting technique." They meant well, I told myself. They were showing concern for my welfare. But somehow their concern always felt like another reminder of my limitations. Another gentle suggestion that I wasn't quite capable of managing my own life. "I'm careful," I said simply. "Good," Dad said. "We worry about you, sweetie. Working in that environment around all those different kinds of people." Different kinds of people. He meant people without college degrees, people who worked with their hands, people who weren't destined for professional success. People like me, apparently. The conversation was interrupted by a small commotion near the front of the restaurant. I could see several servers clustered around the hostess station, and there seemed to be some kind of discussion happening. One of the servers was pointing toward our table. "I wonder what that's about," Mom said, craning her neck to see. "Probably some problem with another table," Jessica said dismissively. "Places like this have to deal with all kinds of difficult customers. People who don't understand how fine dining works." As she spoke, a distinguished man in an expensive suit approached our table. He had silver hair, a warm smile, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was someone important. The server stepped aside respectfully as he passed. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm Robert Martinez, the general manager. I hope you're all enjoying your evening." "Everything has been wonderful," Jessica said immediately, switching to her professional voice. "The service is impeccable, the food is outstanding. You run an excellent establishment." "Thank you so much," Robert replied. "I'm delighted to hear that. Actually, I was hoping to speak with Ms. Chen." His eyes found mine across the table. "Miss Sarah Chen." The table went quiet. Everyone stared at me with confused expressions. "That's me," I said quietly. Robert's face broke into a genuine smile. "Miss Chen, I apologize for interrupting your dinner. I wanted to personally welcome you back to Bellacourt. It's been several weeks since your last visit and we've missed you." I could feel my family's eyes boring into me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Thank you, Robert. It's good to be back. Your usual private dining room is prepared if you'd prefer more privacy for your celebration," he continued. "I know you typically prefer the quieter atmosphere for family gatherings." Jessica's mouth was slightly open. Dad was staring at Robert like he was speaking a foreign language. Mom looked completely bewildered. "Actually, we're fine here tonight," I replied calmly. "But thank you for the offer." "Of course," Robert said with a slight bow. "Please let me know if there's anything at all I can do to make your evening more enjoyable. The chef has prepared a special dessert selection in honor of your mother's birthday, if you'd like to see it later." "That's very thoughtful," I said. "We'll definitely take a look." "Wonderful. Enjoy the rest of your dinner." Robert nodded politely to the table and walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. "What?" Dad started, then stopped. "How does he?" Mom began, then trailed off. Jessica was the first to find her voice. "Sarah, how does the manager of Bellacourt know you? Have you been here before?" I took a sip of my wine and considered my answer carefully. "A few times." "A few times?" Marcus repeated. "Sarah, this place costs more than your weekly salary. How could you afford to eat here a few times?" "And he said your usual private dining room," Jessica added, her voice rising slightly. "Sarah, private dining rooms here cost thousands of dollars. They're for corporate events and special occasions. How would you even know they exist?" I could see the wheels turning in their heads, trying to reconcile what they'd just witnessed with everything they believed about my life. It didn't compute. In their minds, I was Sarah the warehouse worker, Sarah the college dropout, Sarah who couldn't afford a nice dinner. I wasn't Sarah who had usual private dining rooms at exclusive restaurants. "I don't understand," Mom said slowly. "Sweetie, have you been spending money you don't have? Are you in debt?" The familiar protective instinct kicked in. For 8 years I'd let them believe what they wanted to believe about my life. It had been easier than explaining, easier than dealing with their questions and skepticism. But sitting there watching them struggle to process the simple fact that the restaurant manager knew my name, I realized how deeply their assumptions had taken root. "I'm not in debt, Mom," I said quietly. "Then how?" Jessica began. "Excuse me." Another voice interrupted our conversation. This time it was our original server, looking slightly nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but there's been a small issue with your bill." Jessica immediately tensed. "What kind of issue?" "Well," the server said, glancing at me uncertainly, "our system is showing that Ms. Chen's employee discount should have been applied automatically, but there seems to be a technical problem. Would you prefer to have it adjusted now, or should we handle it after dinner?" The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. "Employee discount?" Dad said faintly. The server looked confused by the family's reaction. "Sir. Ms. Chen's ownership group employee benefits." We typically comp the entire meal for family celebrations, but the system isn't recognizing her tonight for some reason. Jessica's face had gone completely white. Ownership group? I can handle it later, I told the server quickly. Don't worry about it now. Of course, Ms. Chin. I'll make a note in the system. The server disappeared again, leaving us in another stunned silence. This time no one spoke for a full minute. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. Sarah, he said carefully, what exactly do you do for work? I looked around the table at my family's shocked faces. Mom was clutching her napkin like a lifeline. Dad was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted wings. Jessica looked like someone had just told her the world was flat. I work at a warehouse, I said simply. But the employee discount, Mom whispered. The ownership group. I work at the warehouse that supplies Bellacourt, I explained calmly. Along with 12 other restaurants in the city. That was technically true. I did work at the warehouse. I just hadn't mentioned that I owned it. You're a distributor? Dad asked, hope creeping into his voice. Maybe his daughter wasn't a complete failure after all. Maybe she'd just been modest about her job title. Something like that, I replied. Before anyone could ask more questions, Robert appeared at our table again, this time looking slightly apologetic. Miss Chin, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt again, but we have a situation that requires your attention. The kitchen manager from Bistro Laurent just called. They're completely out of the organic microgreens for tomorrow's dinner service, and they're hoping you can arrange an emergency delivery tonight. He paused, noticing the family's expressions. I told them you were celebrating your mother's birthday and shouldn't be disturbed, but they said it was urgent. Apparently they have a food critic coming tomorrow, and the dish isn't possible without your greens. I sighed softly. Tell them I'll have a delivery driver there by 10 tonight. They can pick up what they need from the climate-controlled storage at the main facility. You're a lifesaver, Robert said gratefully. I'll let them know immediately. He disappeared once more. The silence this time was different. Heavier. I could practically hear my family's minds working, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't match the picture they'd been looking at for 8 years. Sarah, Jessica said slowly, what exactly is your job title? I met her eyes across the table. I'm the owner and operator of Chin Premium Foods. We're the exclusive supplier of organic produce and specialty ingredients to 43 restaurants in the metropolitan area. The words seemed to hit them like physical blows. Owner. Mom whispered. 43 restaurants? Dad said faintly. Marcus was staring at me like I'd just performed magic. Sarah, how is that possible? When did you start a company? How did you afford to start a company? The questions I'd been avoiding for 8 years were finally being asked. I took another sip of wine and decided it was time for the truth. I started the company 6 years ago, I said calmly. With the money I saved working warehouse jobs and the small business loan I qualified for based on my produce distribution experience. But you dropped out of college, Jessica said, her voice sounding strange and distant. I left college to work full-time when Dad had his heart attack, I corrected gently. Someone needed to cover the medical bills and keep money coming in. I took a job at a produce distribution center. We know that part, Dad said impatiently. But then what happened? I learned the business, I replied. I worked every position in that warehouse for 2 years. Loading trucks, managing inventory, handling customer accounts, coordinating with suppliers. I learned how restaurants operate, what they need when they need it. I paused, remembering those exhausting early days. I noticed that the high-end restaurants were struggling to find reliable sources for organic and specialty ingredients. The big distributors focused on volume, not quality. Small restaurants couldn't get consistent access to the products they needed. Mom was listening with her mouth slightly open. So you started your own company? I started small, I said. 1 restaurant, 1 delivery truck, 3 types of organic herbs that I grew myself in a rented greenhouse space. The restaurant loved the quality and reliability. They referred me to another restaurant. Then another. Jessica shook her head slowly. But Sarah, starting a business requires capital, equipment, facilities. How did you afford all that on a warehouse salary? I lived extremely simply for 4 years, I said. I rented a studio apartment for $300 a month. I drove a 15-year-old car. I ate rice and beans for dinner most nights. Every penny I didn't spend on absolute necessities went into the business. The truth was more complicated than that, but it was easier than explaining the careful calculations I'd made, the risks I'd taken, the 18-hour days I'd worked to build something from nothing. Every family gathering, you let us think you were struggling, Marcus said, his voice tinged with something that might have been accusation. I wasn't struggling, I replied. I was building something. There's a difference. But why didn't you tell us? Mom asked, tears forming in her eyes. Sweetie, we've been so worried about you. We thought you were barely getting by. I looked at her kind, confused face and felt the familiar ache in my chest. Because every time I tried to explain what I was doing, you told me I was making excuses. When I mentioned working 60-hour weeks, you said I was being dramatic. When I talked about my business plans, you said I was being unrealistic. The table was quiet again. I could see them thinking back, remembering conversations they'd forgotten or dismissed. You said you were going to start a catering business, Dad said slowly. 3 years ago at Christmas. You mentioned having some restaurant clients. 15 restaurant clients, I corrected. And it wasn't catering. It was specialty produce distribution. But when I tried to explain, Jessica said I was playing pretend entrepreneur, and Marcus said I should focus on realistic goals. Jessica's face flushed red. I didn't mean. So I stopped trying to explain, I continued calmly. It was easier to let you think what you wanted to think than to keep defending myself. Robert appeared at our table one more time, looking apologetic but urgent. Miss Chin, I'm so sorry, but I have one more request. The owner of that new steakhouse downtown is here tonight, and he's hoping to discuss becoming a client. Should I tell him you're unavailable, or would you be willing to speak with him briefly? I glanced around the table at my family's shell-shocked faces. Tell him I'll be happy to speak with him, but not tonight. Have him call my office on Monday morning. My assistant can schedule a proper meeting. Perfect, Robert said. Thank you for your patience. He started to walk away, then turned back. Oh, and Miss Chin? The chef wanted me to tell you that the new microgreen varieties you suggested have been absolutely perfect. The critics have specifically mentioned them in 3 different reviews this month. After he left, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, Jessica cleared her throat. Sarah, she said quietly, how big is your company? I considered how to answer that question. Last year we generated about $4.2 million in revenue. Marcus choked on his wine. Million. We supply 43 restaurants now, I said. Everything from small neighborhood bistros to places like this. Each client orders between $2,000 and $15,000 worth of product per week, depending on their size and menu requirements. Dad was doing mental math, his eyes widening as he worked through the numbers. Sarah, that means you're making. The company is profitable, I said simply. I pay myself a reasonable salary, and the rest goes back into expanding operations and improving quality. But where, how, Mom started then stopped. Sweetie, we had no idea. Why didn't you just tell us you were successful? I looked at her dear, bewildered face and felt a complex mix of love and frustration. Mom, I tried. For years I tried. But every time I mentioned my work, you changed the subject or offered advice on finding a real job. Eventually, I realized it was easier to just let you believe what you wanted to believe. We were trying to help, Jessica said defensively. We thought you were struggling. We thought you needed guidance. You thought I was a failure, I said quietly. And when the evidence didn't support that assumption, you ignored the evidence. The dessert course arrived, interrupting our conversation. The chef had indeed prepared something special. An elaborate chocolate sculpture with "Happy Birthday" written in gold leaf. It was beautiful and clearly expensive. This is lovely, Mom said weakly, staring at the dessert like it might explode. Compliments of the house, our server said with a smile. For Miss Chen's mother's birthday. After the server left, we sat in silence, picking at the elaborate dessert. The mood had shifted completely from the beginning of the evening. Jessica looked deflated. Marcus kept glancing at me like he was seeing a stranger. Mom and Dad seemed lost in thought. I don't understand, Dad said eventually. If you're successful, why do you still live in that small apartment? Why do you drive that old car? Because I'm comfortable there, I replied. And because building a business requires careful financial management. I invest my profits back into equipment and facilities and employee salaries. I pay myself enough to live comfortably, but I don't need to live extravagantly. But you could afford to, Jessica said. You could afford a nice house, a new car, expensive clothes. I could, I agreed. But I don't want those things right now. Maybe someday. For now, I'm focused on building something sustainable. Marcus shook his head slowly. All this time we thought you needed our help. We thought you were the one family member who wasn't successful. I never needed your help, I said gently. I needed your respect. I needed you to listen when I tried to tell you about my life instead of assuming you knew better. The drive home was quiet. Mom had insisted on taking a dozen photos of the dessert and the restaurant interior, suddenly proud to be associated with a place where her daughter was treated like royalty. Dad kept asking questions about the business. How many employees I had, what my profit margins were, whether I was planning to expand. Jessica was the quietest of all. As we stood outside the restaurant waiting for the valet to bring our cars, she finally spoke. Sarah, I owe you an apology, she said quietly. We all do. I've been condescending. I thought I was helping, but I was just being cruel. You weren't trying to be cruel, I replied. You genuinely believed I needed guidance. But I should have listened, she said. I should have paid attention to what you were actually saying instead of making assumptions. Marcus nodded. We all should have. Sarah, your business is incredible. What you've built is really impressive. Thank you, I said simply. Mom hugged me tightly as we said goodbye. I'm so proud of you, sweetie, she whispered. I always was, but now I understand what I was proud of. As I drove home in my reliable 15-year-old Honda, I reflected on the evening. Part of me felt vindicated. Finally, my family understood that I wasn't the failure they'd imagined. But mostly I felt sad. Sad that it had taken so long, sad that they'd missed so much of my actual life, sad that their assumptions had been so deeply rooted that it took a restaurant manager and a dessert with gold leaf to make them reconsider. But maybe it was a beginning. Maybe now we could have conversations about my actual life instead of the version they'd created in their minds. Maybe they'd start asking questions instead of making assumptions. Or maybe nothing would change and next week they'd go back to treating me like the family disappointment who just happened to own a successful business. Either way, I'd be fine. I'd been building my life quietly and successfully for years without their understanding or approval. Their recognition was nice, but it wasn't necessary. I had work to do in the morning. 3 new restaurant clients to visit, a shipment of exotic mushrooms to coordinate, and a greenhouse expansion to plan. My real life was waiting whether my family understood it or not. The Chin Premium Foods delivery truck would be making its rounds at dawn, bringing fresh, quality ingredients to restaurants across the city. Including, as always, the very best organic microgreens to Bellacourt, where the staff would greet my driver by name and ask about my mother's birthday celebration. Because some things didn't need to change even when everything else did.